Hello, everyone. I'm keenly aware that I have about 20 minutes to cover a continent with 4.5 billion people. So I'm going to try and get stuck into it. First of all, so I can understand who I'm talking to. Who in this room exports their wine to Asia? Yeah? Good. How many of you are in China? Nice. Japan? Hong Kong? India? How many of you are happy with your exports to Asia? That's what I thought. So excellent. Everybody has some skin in the game, but nobody thinks they're killing it there. So good work to be done. So fortunately for me, unlike Justin, I'm happy that I'm coming after Deborah, because she actually did a great overview of the Asian market and sort of attitudes in the market. I'm going to be hammering in a bit more to some of these points. The first section of my presentation was a bit more about breaking down the market, what the opportunities are. I'm going to go through that fairly quickly so that we can get into the sexy stuff, the social, the flavor preferences, the packaging stuff. Yeah? Okay, so just a very quick question. You might be asking, why does Asia merit a whole other 20 minutes? I'd argue that because our economies are still growing, despite Donald Trump's best efforts. We have currently low per capita consumption of wine, but in most places it's growing. And we have New Zealand exports to Asia on a per liter basis have a higher price that by a multiple of 2 or more than your exports anywhere else in the world. So we're already moving you guys into a more premium category. And having myself had experience working in the very lowest price point in the Chinese market, especially, it's an ugly place to be. You guys are happy to be out of that space. So just to touch on these very quickly, the growing middle class, as Deborah said before, defined anywhere from $4,000 US to $40,000 US of income a year. So although over the next billion entrants into the middle class, 88% of them are going to be in Asia, and currently about half of the global middle class is in Asia. Unfortunately, we're probably going to be mainly in that lower segment of the middle class, right? So not people who are going to be able to go out every day and drink 82 Lafite. But exciting news, younger wine consumers. So in China, 50% of wine consumers are under 30. In India, millennials are about 50% of wine consumers. Remember that India, their millennial cutoff is a little bit later because in the areas in India where you can drink, the drinking age is 25 and up. So a little bit of a restriction there. Japan, for those of you who are there, will probably know it's less of a youth culture around wine consumption. Only about 20% of regular wine consumers are what we would define as young, whereas more than 50% are over 54. Sorry for those of you who are over 54 and feel young still. So female consumption. Definitely in Asia, we have very strong female penetration in the wine trade. Female wine consumers, female wine influencers, really sort of critical to the market. But on the plus side, wine is not marginalized as a woman's drink, as it is many places in the world. In fact, you'll find that rosé consumption, rosé purchasing is actually more common among men than among women. So erase some of these stereotypes from your mind. Rapid uptake of digital media, this is something I'm going to be digging into more, so I won't dwell on it right now. The highest penetration of digital media is actually in South Korea, so 84%, all the way down to 19% in India, but it's really an outlier. Most of Asia, including China at 65%, is quite digitally savvy. E-commerce really is only a major factor in China for wine at the moment, and it's actually illegal in many markets. So challenges, as I've just touched on, channels like e-commerce are forbidden in India, South Korea, Taiwan, although there are workarounds, we hear. Other factors like restrictive sales hours, so in Thailand, certain hours of the day and certain days when you cannot purchase alcohol. And then there are taxes, sadly, so nearly 400% in Thailand, which boggles the mind. including excise tax, municipal, health, and import tariffs, so tax upon tax upon tax, making India look relatively reasonable at 152% plus state tariffs, and South Korea fairly reasonable at 70. Low cultural acceptance of alcoholic beverages. Deborah touched on this before. Red wine, we hear a lot about red wine and health, and it is true. It's an important motivating factor for a lot of different people, although we'll might get into later how specifically that plays out. But unfortunately, it's only red wine that has that benefit, both in China, where it's talked about a lot, and in India. Sonal Holland, fellow MW based in India, who did a survey of 900 plus consumers to reflect the low customer awareness. Only 28% of the people she surveyed couldn't name a single grape variety. So quite a bit more education to be done in a lot of these markets. And remember, although the Asian flush is sort of a stereotype about Asian people not being able to process alcohol, that really mainly applies to southern China. Those parts of Asia that were Mongol influenced, for instance, South Korea, actually can probably drink all of you under the table. However, you have to India also, you have to bear in mind that you're facing very strong competition from other alcohol types. So whiskey, rum, and beer in India, soju and beer in Korea, etc. Economic uncertainty, I won't Trump bash too much, but the trade war in China, certainly a massive factor, going from the past couple of years where young white-collar workers have really focused on something, the consumption upgrade, the 消费升级. We're now reversing that, sadly, to the 消费降级, which means the consumption downgrade. So a real burst bubble of enthusiasm, but this is not to say, I mean, the economy is still growing, just at a slightly slower pace. Japan's main challenges lie in its shrinking population and aging population. And in India, the rupee fell throughout 2018. Removal of cash from the system caused a lot of panicking, but actually has made a move towards digital payments, which I think will be helpful if they ever legalize e-commerce. So, breaking it down, if we think about Asia, we want to be thinking about Greater China, so that's mainland China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Macau, Northeast Asia, Japan, South Korea, Southeast Asia, of which many of the countries are predominantly Muslim, so we're probably not going to dwell on them as much in this presentation, but that's things like the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, Singapore, and then South Asia, in which we'll mainly be focusing on India. Now, like Deborah, I'm going to be focusing quite heavily on China for the simple reason that it is the 800-pound gorilla. It's not a huge amount of competition elsewhere. At the moment, China is the biggest export market in Asia for New Zealand. 2.5 million litres imported in the year ending June 2018, up 11% in volume and 18% in value. So we're premiumizing all the time with our imports. And actually, China is one of the few markets where New Zealand exports are more heavily weighted towards reds than whites, but that's shifting over time. Used to be 70% red, now closer to 57.5% red. Japan, more white than other markets in Asia, but only about 38%. South Korea, the amount of white has been fairly stable over time, but red has lost ground to sparkling wines. So the sparkling Sauvignon Blanc that we tried yesterday in Tim's tasting, definitely a style worth considering for future growth. And then I won't, since it really tails off quite dramatically from there, I won't dwell too long because I want to get ahead, and we're about halfway through my time. So wine style. Done a shameless plug for myself in here. For those of you who are not my followers yet on Instagram. This was a project I started because of exactly something that Tim talked about yesterday, which is the difficulty that we have when we're trying to communicate with people about flavors using language. I will point out, Tim, are you in the room? We do have cinnamon in China, Tim, called ro gui. It's just in 5-spice, exactly. And I think a critical point to note is that in China, cinnamon is not used as a sweet spice, right? So trying to say sweet spices like cinnamon sounds a bit bizarre when you're speaking to somebody who eats Chinese cuisine predominantly. But I think my larger point is that we need to be using more abstract terms. We need to be using evocative language and perhaps imagery to try to get people a better idea of what your wine is like. We think that the more specific we get and the more we tell people exactly what kind of fennel flavors are in our wine, the more they'll be able to understand. And to be honest, it's actually specific flavors in the research that I've done are far less compelling than terms like mellow, rounded, soft. Ehrenberg Bass did some research and found the same thing. And the way that people express their own flavor preferences reflects this quite well. So in China, we've talked about this question of sweetness, and I was speaking to DJ actually about the potential for lighter wines in our market. And while there isn't yet, I think, enough awareness of light wines as a category, particularly in the Chinese market, there is definitely a space for wines with a little bit of residual sweetness, so that sort of 10 grams to 30 grams of residual sugar. To be very clear, this does not mean that sweet wine does well in the Chinese market. Heavy sweet wines, other than ice wine, which has traditionally been used as a gift, are not particularly favored. People think of sweetness as something that is detrimental to health. So it's really not, it's an important distinction to make between slight sweetness and actual sweet wine. And moderate acidity is also important. I think sweetness and residual sugar really play a role in achieving that balance. In terms of the actual flavors you often find in Sauvignon Blanc, I was looking, Professor Li Demei of Beijing Agricultural University recently produced some research looking at different cuisine styles in China and how they influence the flavor preferences of consumers. The one that was probably most sympathetic to New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, so most likely to like grass and yellow stone fruit flavors, was Huaiyang cuisine, so in the area south of Shanghai. And generally speaking, it's the eastern corridor going all the way from Harbin to Suzhou, where you're really able to find more people who are interested in consuming white wine, which is otherwise sort of relegated to banquets and kind of cocktail occasions. Japan also, it's interesting to note some of the overlaps, in fact, with what Junior was talking about. Definitely interested in sort of easy drinking citrus and stone fruit flavors. There's a marked lack of interest in oak and oxidative aging, so nutty, toasty flavors, or green flavors among Japanese consumers, although younger consumers have expressed more interest in a diversity of flavor profiles. Pardon me. South Koreans, again, described their own preferences as approachable, with a balance of softness, sweetness, balanced with a level of crispness. Right? These are all attractive sounding words that are not too specific. You're not trying to tell people directly what something tastes like specifically, but the feeling it will give them. Again, not that much interest in oak flavors in white wine in the South Korean market. There is definitely more of an interest in even sweeter wine in the Korean market. So consumers aged 25 to 44 were most likely to name Moscato as their favorite grape variety. Indians tend to like fruitier, riper styles, meaning that they tend to prefer New World wines over Old World. And in fact, because of the prevalence of wine by the glass, so Sonal found in her research that a high percentage of consumers were interested in by the glass consumption rather than by the bottle. Bold, flavorful wines do have great potential. Thailand similarly has an interest in bold, punchy, and even heavier wine styles. I will back Tim up on this point. It is true. Very few consumers in this market actually think of pairing wine with their cuisine as an important motivator in purchase decisions. Saying to somebody, particularly saying a particular dish in your cuisine goes amazingly with my wine, is a waste of time. Honestly, if you look at the way that people are consuming food, for the most part, either family style, where everything comes out together and you eat off of a lazy Susan, or sometimes in these banquet settings, a lot of courses, but each one only remaining on the table for, say, 5 minutes at a time. You can't have a new glass of wine with every course. So you're much better off trying to think about holistically, what is the style of the cuisine, and does our wine make sense with that? Using some of the principles Tim talked about, right? Sweetness of the food on average, acidity levels of the food on average, spiciness, things like this. I've touched on this already, but how to talk about wine. Abstract language is more appealing. The imagery I found to be quite compelling in my market. Music, so Mel, your video, I think, hit it on the head. Krug have done a big project with wine and music. And it especially appeals, she said she found, to female consumers who would find themselves a bit more uncomfortable when it was all sort of discussions of malolactic fermentation and lees contact. Suddenly, when there was a discussion of the music and how it made people felt much more comfortable expressing their opinions. They felt much more like it had much more relevance to their own lives. So now, packaging and image, aesthetics. I would never recommend that you appropriate directly from these cultures, but I do think that it's useful when you're thinking about your packaging and how well it's going to appeal to people in these different markets about what traditional aesthetic values are. Right, so I personally, I collaborate with a glassware brand that's based in Thailand, but is sold all around Asia. And we found there's an incredible diversity in terms of what aesthetic and practical values people are looking for in the glassware, where I'm getting to the end of my time. But for example, in India, people were really looking for embellished glasses with unusual shapes, something new and different, something they hadn't seen before. In China, they wanted something that was striking and classy. It's very important in the Chinese market for wine to be seen as classy, particularly above a certain price point, which is why I think some of these sort of cartoony labels that play well in other new markets have a little bit of a hard time breaking out of a certain price bracket. And in Thailand, they were more practical. They wanted shorter stems, sturdy, not breakable. And it's also aesthetics of other senses. Think about in India and Thailand, products need a certain richness in their perfume and packaging that tends to be more vibrant than in the West. China is often more ornate. You see a lot of use of gold. So I've actually included labels of wine made from domestic wine production in each of these countries, right? So Japanese, made with the beautiful paper. Grace Vineyard, this black and gold aesthetic. The Thai wine that are borrowing from traditional Thai patterns and textiles. And the Indian Sula that's really embraced this vibrancy, sort of technicolor nature of Indian aesthetics. So other factors to think about when you're thinking about Asian aesthetics. Cuteness, the Japanese term kawaii. We are also the continent that invented the contact lenses that make your iris look massive so that you look like a cartoon character. There is definitely an interest in cuteness, but again, I think by playing too hard with this cuteness aesthetic, there is a risk that you limit yourself to a certain price bracket. So one case for how I think can be done quite well, has anybody heard of the brand Tussock Jumper? I think it's a sort of international brand where they use little animals wearing cute sweaters. I mean, everybody loves little animals, right? Critter labels, I know they're old hat in many other parts of the world. They still have a little bit of a ways to go in some of our markets. But a case of a major fail, I would say there was an Alsatian sparkling wine called Katzenthal meaning, cat valley. And they applied a label that had a cat on it for the Japanese and the Hong Kong markets. And I think it really forced the producer to lower the price, ultimately. They had to go on special because people weren't willing to bring a sparkling wine to a high-end dinner that had a cat on it. So. I'll come back to this one. But packaging specifics, as everybody said, these heavy bottles, I'm so sorry. It makes me ill to think about the amount of glass, the amount of carbon that's generated from these heavier bottles, but there is an interest. It's not just heavier bottles, it's also deeper punts. There's something kind of oddly Freudian going on there, but people like a deep punt. And please, before you go, I know you guys are selling a white wine product, but flint bottles are not appropriate for a market where you don't know what kind of conditions the bottles are going to be stored in. They're probably going to be in the light a lot of the time, and they may not move that quickly. So you need to be thinking about the longevity of your product as well as its appearance. Gift boxes, a little bit challenging. I think probably something that's maybe had its moment a little bit, and also to the extent that they are still used, the trends change so quickly that it's actually worth, if you are going to use one, producing them in market rather than producing them here and shipping them. There's a little bit of a sustainability thing there, perhaps. New Zealand identity, just talking about the labels. It's a funny thing because if you look at traditional Chinese aesthetics, green is not a lucky color. There's a phrase, da lu mao, which means to wear a green hat, which means being a cuckold. So not the most positive association. However, when I recently did a branding session at Hong Kong Poly U with mainly mainland students, almost universally, they said that the ideal label that they would put on a Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc would be something graphically quite simple, using quite a lot of black and white and green. They like the green, they like the lushness of New Zealand. So when you're thinking about the photographs, the imagery you're going to be putting online, make sure your hills are not dry when you take your photographs. The greenness is important. Okay, I have some more other packaging points, but I think I'm going to move on because out of time. Mal, how much time do I have? I'm completely out of time. Okay. Okay, I'm just going to do my digital bit. We'll have to skip the case studies. But social media. How many of you are on social media in China? Weixin, Weibo. Okay, so social media has an interesting intersection at the moment that's occurring with e-commerce. Again, I'm not going to touch on the other markets because it's really not that important outside of China, but social commerce is something that we really need to be looking at. Social media is very expensive in China. Sounds weird to say, but there's nothing free. Obviously, you can be on there for free, but to actually generate the traffic and build yourself into a sort of influential platform where it's worth your while to spend the time, you're thinking about sort of 35,000 RMB a month. What was that in New Zealand dollars? 7,000 Kiwi a month. So unless you have an obvious way to capture that value, it's not really worthwhile. So a thing that I was talking to Ian Dye, where are you in the audience? Wave at me. About is a new channel that I think is probably the easiest to make use of, probably, is this channel they're calling contemporary retail. So it's individuals selling wine on WeChat just by sending it out to their groups. But for this, in order for this to actually make any sense, they need some content to be able to tell your brand story. You don't want somebody you don't know, because you're going to have to rely on a lot of these people to be making up your story on your behalf. So what I would suggest is get on video. You know, one of the things Deborah and I have been observing in the past couple of days, it's really nice being in a room full of this many good-looking men at once. You guys are hot. I'm married to a Kiwi. I chose well. Think about getting yourself on video. What is your brand story? At the end of the day, what is the unique thing about your brand? It's you. It's you. People are what's unique. So KOLs are another thing that Deborah touched on as well. But think about who is representing you. Do you want somebody, I'll just very quickly pull up. Isabella Ko, so another very successful KOL in the Chinese market, has really built an image around being sophisticated, around being well-read. She works with Page One bookstores in Beijing, where she supplies wine for their F&B outlets, and she chooses wines deliberately that fit into a literary theme. And I think it's things like this. It's trying to figure out how you can fit into the culture that people are already enjoying and align your brand story in some way. So I hope I've given you a couple of ideas for how you might take your own story and fit it into the things that people are already enjoying and looking for, and hopefully we'll get into some of the other discussions in Q&A. I will now cede the floor to Paul.